Hey, this week we're talking to Steve Greenbacker. Steve is a executive and board member cyber advisory consultant with Mandiant. But when I knew Steve, we were working together back at Booz Allen. And what I find really fascinating about Steve is his ability to make connections with people and really cut through to individuals' needs. And that's what we're going to talk to him about today. I think you'll really enjoy, so stay tuned.
I heard your joke earlier about the hoodie you were wearing the last one.
Yeah, I thought I was going to be like tech, cool tech guy wearing a hoodie. And I thought it was okay. But actually, when I was thinking about what I wanted to wear today, which I did put a little thought into, which is a little sad given the result, I thought, I'm talking to Steve, I've got to wear a vest. So I went out and found my vest. It's a little tight around the midsection. I haven't worn it in a while, but it's like, I'm talking to Steve, I got to wear a vest. And I'm so glad that you wore a vest too. Otherwise it would have been like,
a bit wouldn't have worked, right?
It wouldn't have worked. But Steve, I've known you long enough to know that you're always wearing a vest.
And I was in my closet trying to figure out which one I was going to wear too. So I put thought into
which vest. Yeah. Cool. Well, I don't know. I didn't tell you I was going to ask this, but can I ask about that picture behind you? I think anybody watching the video might have a question.
Yeah, sure. So that is an Iraqi police decal from the side of an Iraqi police vehicle. So when I was in Ramadi and we were working out of a joint security station, this was like one of the parting gifts that I got. So I'm sure there's some like Toyota Hilux driving around with the sticker missing off the side.
Oh, nice. And how long were you over there?
I was there for 7 months in 2007 into 2008.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. You and I worked together I want to say we worked together for like 10 years, but my sense of time is a little bit warped. And we actually, you and your wife came up and stayed with us for a day or two. And in that moment, when you're like standing in the doorway and it turns out you're like 6'5", I'm like, I don't know if I've actually ever seen Steve in person before. It was such a weird moment for me, because we worked together like via Zoom and whatnot for a couple of years. And I'm a fan of the video technology, but like I'd forgotten that we really hadn't met in person other than that one time that you were like the new guy in the room or something like that. And, asked a question that I thought was ridiculous. And I'm sure I responded in kind to the question you were asking. It's just a crazy world that we live in.
And as I think back, right, I think I was sitting down that entire thing. I think I was there when you walked in and I probably hung out in that conference room afterwards. So I may not have even stood up for that meeting.
Yeah, I don't think so. I'm a fairly tall person, like hair under 6'2". And I don't know if you do this, but I notice when somebody's taller than me. It doesn't happen that often, but it's just like a weird tick of mine. And so when I saw you, I was like, this is weird. This is a weird new element of our relationship.
I thought it was a weird tick of mine because I'm actually the runts of the litter, right? I've got brothers that are 6'5" and 6'9". So like, for someone to be taller than me, like that's the situation I remember growing up. And then it's obviously different in the real world and people are normal height. So it's jarring a bit for me because I connect that with my brothers being taller.
So, we work together and I actually don't know this, but I always find it interesting. What was your path like into cyber? Like, how did you get into that room where we met?
Yeah, I tell the story a lot because I don't think there is a standard path into this career field, right? Because it is relatively new, right? If you went to school, decades ago, there wasn't a set program to get you into a cyber role. So I actually went to college for a completely unrelated engineering degree that I used 0 time in my real life practicing. Right out of college, I joined the military. I bounced around between an infantry reconnaissance, and then embassy security role, all in a staff position. And then it became time for me to choose the next thing to do. And I kept getting told, well, you need to come back to like headquarters Marine Corps and come push papers, right? Well, nobody joined the Marine Corps to do paperwork, right? So I figured I had this unique skill set, specifically in physical security, but also in risk management in general. So I chose to leave at that point. And then I first worked in a utility organization doing NERC SIP compliance. And that was, based on a lot of my physical security background, but also what I've been doing with like classified material control and classified networks and things like that in the military. But it really kind of blew up my cyber experience. So I was there for a little while, made a jump to a pharmaceutical company where we started just building out a CISO organization, and kind of inevitably from that, there were components of a cyber organization. So that kind of was, an introduction to like cybersecurity management, right? Again, nothing I'd ever had, standard training on, but just kind of learning on the job and figuring out. And what I found helped me be successful was exactly that, right? You would think that, lack of familiarity, lack of experience would be a problem, but I kind of found this niche of being able to talk about cyber topics in very plain language for those who aren't super technical, because that's how I had to translate it in my own mind to be able to figure out that work, right? So especially coming into the consulting world, certainly have enough years and relevancy and knowledge of what's happening at this point, but to be able to still, change that language into the language of business and the language of just, human examples and comparisons that we can use to kind of make that information accessible. That's really been a key skill set that I've kind of nurtured over time.
Yeah, that's an interesting lead into one of the things that I really wanted to talk with you about. We have a mutual acquaintance or mutual friend, depending on, I guess he can come on here and defend that we're not friends, but Jason, we know Jason, always like to talk about people's superpowers. And when I was thinking about how would I classify Steve Greenbacker, the expression that came to mind was CISO Whisperer, which maybe you like or don't like, but I've seen, many cases where, cyber executives quite literally have commented about wanting to lock you to the desk to keep you from going anywhere, or, trying to call you and, find time with Steve, which is kind of a position that I think a lot of us in the industry who want to have influence on, these executive leadership type of folks want to find ourselves in, and it just seems to come very naturally to you. And so maybe it's a little bit of what you were just talking about, but how do you establish those kinds of relationships and that type of credibility?
Yeah, I think if we think about the CISO's role in terms of the organization, right? They're obviously leading a very technical team, doing very high level work. But in most organizations, they don't live in that ecosystem outside of their own team. So they really have to become a good ambassador for that work, right? So I found a lot of folks have grown in their career inside of cyber, and what made them successful in the past was the deep technical knowledge, the ability to iterate on that. But when they rise to that level, right, like the stark contrast between being a technical leader and being a business leader becomes problematic, right? So it's really about meeting people where they are, right? If you think about different types of CISOs, you certainly have those, deep technical subject matter experts, but you also have business leaders that happen to be doing cyber today, right? And I think part of, my role over the years of being able to kind of operate in those spaces is finding what kind of support they need, right? If they're super technical, I can certainly help them, polish and translate their message to their board and other teams within their organization. And if they're coming from a business perspective, helping them understand, what their role on the cyber team is and what kind of leadership they need to focus on. So I think it's more about, empathy and, kind of self-awareness, right, in that type of role, because that's not necessarily something that comes easy if you have, a stereotypical technical background, right? The things that made you excel writing code or doing forensics analysis, right, isn't the same people skills that you need, those soft skills later on. So to really be successful, I think at that CISO level, we kind of need the blend of both, and recognizing where you have, maybe a blind spot, and bring people around you to help with that. That seems to be a great kind of like CISO advisory type niche to be in.
Yeah, I like that word empathy. It kind of invokes this feeling of, you want to, I guess you're coming at it from a perspective of like where you want to support a CISO, like you want to help them in their objective. We did consulting work. I'm thinking about, like, what if I am that engineer, right? Like, I am an engineer, right? And I want to influence up within my organization. There's something that I think we really need to do. And it's difficult for me to get the message across in the way that I'm used to communicating. I don't know, what would your advice be? Like, how do I break through to that next level?
Yeah, I think this is something we deal with, all the time, whether in a practitioner role or anything else, right? And I see a lot of folks get frustrated when they talk about things from their own perspective, and then the person they're speaking with doesn't see it the same way. And you can kind of throw up your hands and say, well, the person doesn't care, they just don't get it, or whatever it is. But if you put your shoes in, or if you put your feet in the shoes of that other person in the conversation, right? What are the things that a CISO is focused on day to day? What are the metrics of success for their team that they look at? And if you can kind of put your own perspective into those terms, it's an easier translation process, right? Because the CISO has other requirements outside of just cyber, right? There's business leadership requirements. There's, a view on the technical work that might be different from an individual engineer. So not discounting, what those problem sets might be, or what the concerns are, but to be able to translate that into, a common language, is something that I think in any industry is something that is difficult as you progress. Right. One good example I learned from the military was, again, people join the military to do specific things, but the higher you get in military leadership, the less your focus is on, shooting weapons, tactical work, fixing trucks, things like that. And the more it becomes, how do we focus on the logistics? How do we focus on administration? How do we be good people leaders, right? So you get further and further away from that the higher you go. And the same in business, right? You could be working in any industry and focus on the tactical part of that business, but as you progress in your career, you get further and further removed from the actual hands-on work. And I think that's the same dichotomy between like a CISO who's, the senior cyber leader, and somebody who is, still in the day-to-day fight.
Yeah. One of the things that you said a couple of times in there that really triggered me on another type of relationship that can be difficult when you're talking about translating the way that you think and the language that you use. We were fortunate enough to work with a number of multinational organizations, and I think my learning was I have peers that do my same role, but they have a different foundation, like cultural foundation on which they're building up. Everything that they do at work is kind of built on this foundation. And those cultural differences across, trying to operate across regions was something I wasn't really prepared for. And I think you did probably the best job of anybody that I saw dealing with those types of realities as well. So I guess, is what you're saying also true if you have a team, like a European team or a South American team or an Asia-based team? Like, what is your thought process in trying to establish those collaborations?
Yeah, there's different ways we think about things because of the world that or I guess the region of the world that we kind of grew up and were comfortable in, right? A quick story. The only book I've ever read cover to cover happened on a flight from New York to India, where I was about to give a presentation on some new, security program like Insider Threat or something else, right? And the book was The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. And the examples that it used was in like, I guess like 7 or so many domains, how different cultures kind of react to things, right? Like stereotypically, we think about the feedback sandwich when you're, giving a performance review. You say a good thing, you mention the thing that you need to work on, and then you say another good thing, which is a horrible way to do it. But it kind of took that cookie cutter example of how different cultures would experience that, right? With some cultures that have a little bit more of a zero defect mentality, like, oh my God, you said something bad about me. Like, this is the worst performance review I've ever gotten. Whereas other cultures that are a little bit more, high context are like, wow, I'm doing fantastic. There's all these things that are great. They mentioned this little minor thing that I'm going to work on, but the main focus was all this good, and completely discount that negative feedback, right? So how do you approach different things, right? And one of the things I learned in that was, number one, just the overall theme of, the cultural sensitivities to how you interact with other people. But I actually rewrote that entire presentation for that Indian team, because one of the things that I took out of that was, for their type of culture, which is very community based, right? I needed to focus on why this is good for all of us as kind of the hook for why you should be listening to me. Where if you can compare that with what we typically do as Americans, what's the first thing you do, right? What's the first thing we did on this call, right? Who I am and why should I be talking about this topic, right? So I wanted to establish my bona fides at the front end, right? And then talk about why this is helpful to all of us. So I rearranged all that to say, this is why it's important for us. Here's what we're going to talk about. And then at the very end of the presentation, almost like a by the way, here's why I've been talking to you for the last hour. So, certainly learning how, in the little kind of micro interactions that we have day to day, how those things, can influence the way that you're perceived, the way that you're perceiving the activity of others and what they're doing. So that's been really helpful to me.
Yeah, you have such like a nice outward focus. Like, what is the other person's perspective? I think, I'm probably not alone in getting stuck in the internal, like, why don't people agree with me? But that's a really interesting point, like thinking about how somebody else is interpreting the same situation, how they're interpreting the same information from their context. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I can't believe that that's the only book you've read cover to cover.
I mean, that's like in one sitting, you know what I mean? Like, I've never sat down with a book, started on page 1, you don't close the book until you reach, the end. So that's what I mean by read cover to cover. I have, in fact, read books before, John.
I was going to say, maybe that was the most striking revelation. Steve Greenbacker only read one book in his entire life. By the way, as an aside, I've gotten really into kind of my pandemic habit is listening to audiobooks. I don't read so well, among my other flaws, but I've been reading like crazy or listening like crazy. I'm curious, anything good you've read lately?
I've been reading a lot of good books and also audiobooks. What I've noticed, I've lifelong had trouble falling asleep, right? Perfect example of insomniac. And even if it's only like 10 minutes or so, I found just this year, a little bit of reading, turning off the screens, focusing on something that's not worrisome, right? I'm not stress thinking. That'll help me fall asleep. So I've been doing a lot of it. I'll give you a fiction and a nonfiction, right? So the nonfiction relevant to our industry is this is how they tell me this is how the world ends. And maybe in the show notes I can look up who the author is, but I can't think of it right now. But what a great book around how the cyber market, right, for vulnerabilities and exploits and all that works. The impacts of APTs, the market for security researchers, right? They used to get prosecuted and now they're making money off of what they're doing, and how that's kind of evolved. That's been really insightful. And then on the fictional side, I also picked up a COVID hobby. My COVID hobby, as you know, is fly fishing. So starting to read more about that. And there's, a book that later got turned into a movie in the early 90s called A River Runs Through It by Maclean. So it's a great, story of this family and these two brothers growing up, but in the context of fly fishing as well. So I thought that was a really fun story to read. Of course, I'd seen the movie first, and of course, the book is much better than the movie, as it usually is. That was one that I enjoyed.
Yeah.
What about you, John? I'm going to turn this around on you. What's been your favorite thing to read this year?
Geez, I've been reading a lot of different things. I typically don't do too much fiction, although I did listen to every book in, like, I guess what we would now call the Last Kingdom series, now that there's that show on Netflix, and that was great. And it's a little like historical fiction. I've read a lot of books on starting like companies and things like that, clearly with what I'm doing. Probably the most influential, which is ironic, it was this book called Influence, and talking about all of the ways that different, just like biologically, like we are influenced by like different factors in the world. And it was written very much from the perspective of not like, here are the tools to go influence people, but it's really fascinating in terms of like dissecting how people think and how people react emotionally and logically based on how you present information. I think it goes into, I don't think it specifically goes into it, but it kind of connects well with like the Simon Sinek, like Start With Why, emotional elements of how we process information. So that was really cool. And then I'm reading right now Dave Grohl's memoir, the lead man of
Foo Fighters.
Foo Fighters. Oh, thank you. Yeah. And that's interesting to me because he grew up in Northern Virginia and like talks about all these things. And I'm like, yeah, I think exactly the same way. And so there's like a weird connection there. I'm not a punk rocker, shocker, but it's been really fascinating, just hearing the world through his lens and reflecting on my own lens. And I always enjoy stuff like that. And then, anyways, I've gone on too long. I'll link all these things in the show notes in case anybody's interested in what
I'm interested in both those. I'm going to have to read the Dave Grohl book as well as Influence. Sounds really insightful too.
Yeah, I like it. I'll throw you the link, but I'll have the link in the show notes. Actually, and then following on from Influence, one of the things that I thought maybe you would have a good perspective on is, we talked a lot about like internal influences, like how, you find influence or you connect with people. One of the things that I've been noticing a lot is the impact of external influences. So we hear a lot about like cyber insurance and demands of cyber insurers on organizations. And I've been living through the SOC 2 compliance, like audit requirements, and certainly highly regulated organizations have their own layers of external influences on how they create their programs and the capabilities they have and things like that, which is a lot. I mean, there's a lot of, you need to do this. Not all of it makes sense. It's very cookie cutter, but each organization is unique. And so it can be difficult. And, I've been in this industry for a long time and I'm looking at this stuff like, this is not very easy. So I'm curious, what is your perspective on how much these external voices are influencing organizations and how much kind of concern or adjustment is having to be made based on these changing requirements?
Yeah, I think one thing I learned early on with NERC SIP specifically is you can't regulate yourself or an industry into a state of security, right? No matter how well-intentioned a lot of these are, they're typically born out of legislation, right? Obviously. And then, there's individual requirements that are then almost litigated at that point of how are we going to phrase this one, requirement of a new regulation in industry, right? And it gets litigated down to, it is the most, broad-based example of the item, at hand, right? So, you get these, requirements that are either super vague, so they can be interpreted by many different people in different ways, and you almost have to, play luck of the draw of what auditor that you get to come in and take a look at it and their interpretation of it. Or it's, specific enough, but it's not touching at the actual end result of the security, right? Do you have EDR deployed on all endpoints? Well, yes, but it doesn't say that they have to be reporting anywhere, right? So yes, we've actually attached that to our golden image. All of our endpoints have this, but we don't actually do anything with it, right? We are now compliant for that one portion of it, right? And what I found is many of them are attacking the same problem set, right? Like, we need to hold organizations liable for the type of work they do. But as you're likely experiencing, right, there are so many different permutations of regulatory bodies, right? You were talking about SOC, right? If you're also processing payments, there's PCI, obviously, in the utility industry. There's NERC SIP. There's all of the privacy requirements, like California's own state privacy law, and how that translates to the rest of the organization. So what I think, kind of, looking forward in all this, I don't think they're necessarily going to get better. I think we're going to move towards more of a standardized, this is the expectation for a, mature organization. These are the things that you should be doing. But I think, kind of going back to the start, not having the expectation that if we meet these, compliance requirements, therefore we're secure, because that's not the usage of those at all.
Yeah. That's my background in like being the dealing with the data, right, and the blue team analytics side. That makes me, I think, laugh is probably the wrong emotion. I worked with an organization once that, we turned on our firewall monitoring and they didn't set the time zone to match the system that was collecting the data. And so all of the data was showing up in the wrong sequence, and their analytics required the right data sequence. And so it's like, yeah, you did the thing, but like it didn't work end to end. So you're able to check the box, but you didn't actually receive the benefit, which I think is the whole point. And as a young company, it's easy to say like, okay, we should do these things. Like, this is the benefit, and we can set them up in a smart way. For an existing business, it's got to be like a mess. Like, wow, we've done things this way. I mean, it's a whole project, a whole team of people to undo how we've done business so that we can do things in a different way that, is seemingly more secure according to the standard.
And now you're re-architecturing everything.
Yeah. And then that brings its own risk, right? Because things that, were dependent based on, the way that they were set up, and the people who set them up left long ago. And so they are the only ones with institutional knowledge of how all these things like connected. So you change the one micro component, right? And you and I were talking about this the other day. You change that one micro component for a reason, right? Maybe it's a new technology, maybe it's got some new feature, maybe, the process needs to change for some reason. And you don't have the visibility into kind of what those cascading dependencies were. And now you're in a situation where, you've potentially created other problems that you don't have visibility on, which is, not great as well.
But then look at the position that a CISO's in, right? If you think about the political considerations of what they're doing, right? Passing a lot of these regulatory audits is their job, right? So unless you're green on all these things, right, you're not seen as performing well. However, if you're on the board audit committee, right, and you see that cyber is passing all of these audits with flying colors, right, are you going to invest in more cyber programs when the CISO comes around and says, well, we need to do, these additional things? No, everyone's telling us we're in a good spot. So, we're going to spend that money on other risks, right? So being able to, translate some of those, regulatory findings or opinions and be able to translate that into, this is part of a process, right? Like we had invested in this other part. This is where we need to invest next, and show that progression and tell a story around that. That's really important for cyber leaders as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on it, the thing that makes it the most funny to me is like the circular nature of the requirement. Like when we're looking at SOC 2, one of the requirements is to have a third-party risk program to make sure all of your vendors are compliant, like, wink, wink, SOC 2 compliant. So it's like, to be compliant, everybody else has to be compliant. So you kind of create your own requirement, which great business model. Great business model.
Well, now that vendor that does that for you is part of your third-party risk program too, because you're sending all that data to them. Yeah,
don't get me started on that. Our vendor is it's a journey, right? It's not a destination for sure. Okay. Hey, Steve, thanks for coming on. I think this has been a great conversation. There's many more things that I want to talk to you about. I think we got to cut it here due to time. Again, still on the free trial of Zoom. So we've got a minute and 9 seconds left before we're getting cut off. So before we go, anything you want to plug or say or do?
Not that comes to mind, right? But I think everything that's going on with Salem Cyber is fantastic. It's a place that we're going as an industry, right? I don't know if I've even said this to you before, right? So if Salem's not going to do it, somebody else will. It's just a natural progression in the business. So having some really good thought leadership early on is something I feel is really admirable and prescient given the problem set, right? So it's something that our attackers are using, right? It's a way that they're thinking about their work as well. So of course we need to be doing the same on the blue hat side. So,
well, I appreciate the kind words, Steve. Yeah, hopefully we're doing all the right things. But yeah, I think if not us, somebody else is going to succeed in this.
All right, ready to start going?
Good.
Maybe you'll edit this in or out. We'll see.
Who knows?
So one thing I thought was also interesting is point around, Americans having the need to like introduce themselves as part of like hey, here's who I am, here's why I'm relevant to the conversation. But also Americans then on the receiving side of that, like you want to hear that because you're used to it, right? Like, who is this person? Why I want to hear from them before I even listen to them. So I think it is pretty relevant in both ways. One on the saying it end, and second on the listening side. So.
Yeah, and my mind immediately went to another situation that's kind of like similar to how we process information, working across cultures on a task, and this concept of how much people discount the future. So I might, and maybe I would even say culturally, Americans might be more prone to what is a solution that'll work now. Like how do we get this going? Like how do we get across the finish line, and then discount the future pain of like iterating on top of that. And the other cultures that I've worked with are very much put heavier weight on the future. And so they think of problems in terms of what is the correct solution. I don't care if I have to spend more time now engineering, discussing, implementing. It'll be the correct solution, and then we won't have that iterative kind of maintenance cost, or sometimes we like to talk about it like technical debt. We won't have that iterative technical debt, and that can be really frustrating when you're working with like a set of engineers, right? Like you're trying to build like a new security tool, or in one case we were trying to implement the configuration for this monitoring tool, and it's like, what is effective and what is most right? And then you kind of hit this impasse where it's like, I want to spend more time figuring out what exactly the right answer is so we don't have to go back to this again. And somebody else, actually that was not me, that was somebody else, and I'm like, look, you got nothing, let's do something, like let's get to good, let's not let perfect get in the way of great. And it's funny, we even have expressions for that, right? Like let's not let perfect get in the way of good. But I don't think that translates everywhere else. And you can just broadly look at how cultures
And it
approach.
pervades a lot of
to
things because you and I talk a lot about product-led growth, right? And all the things you read there is like lower the barriers to starting, right? Reduce time to value, all the like, okay, get them in, let them onboard them easily, make it very simple to start. And that's a very seemingly American thing to do. And then it's like, all right, it always can get better later, right? You push it off, then maybe you overwhelm yourself later, but you don't want to overwhelm them early. So I wonder
Yeah.
how well that would work. It's a separate thought we probably should talk about another time.
There's so many thoughts, I want to be like an armchair economist now and say like, well, maybe that's the reason why, there's such a strong startup entrepreneurial culture in America, because it's like, let's move quickly, let's iterate, let's create. And then, maybe other cultures, don't appreciate that as much. But I don't actually have data to back that up. That's just kind of like, me culturally explaining things. So
Well,
this is
I've got the armchair.
probably a dangerous topic to get into.
Yeah, well, I've got the armchair if you ever want to do it right here. So,
I'm loving that chair. That reminds me of my entire house. It's kind of like so dated that it's become cool again. I would definitely, I like a wing back though, with like the wings on the side. I don't put my head on it or anything, but like I just like feels like a throne.
yeah. Well, this has helped me to not do what I did last video, which was move the entire time. So
I know. I was telling you, we tried to cut down a few comments and like create some shorts, and you were like bouncing back and forth, and I
Can't
just
catch me.
like couldn't keep you in frame. And so one of these days I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna put it to like techno music, just have you like bouncing around. Yeah. Cool. Well, it was a great conversation with Steve. I think he's got such a sharp people perspective.
Yep.
And it's interesting because I worked with him and never really had that conversation with him when we were working together of, how are you so successful in establishing these relationships? And each one of his answers, it was like, I think about the person I'm communicating with. And that seems like such a simple piece of advice. I'm thinking back to my days as a security engineer, wanting to accomplish certain things. Probably could have gotten a little bit further in a lot of initiatives if I took more into account what is the receiver of some capability or conversation or perspective that I'm trying to share. What is their perspective and how are they thinking about things when I'm, providing information, or maybe, talking in tongues and tech jargon or whatnot. So that was like kind of a really cool meta theme I pulled out, and something that I think Steve is really good at. And I don't know if you've heard, I coined him the CISO Whisperer. But it seems like he is the maybe even a little bit more broadly than that. So I'm sure he'll go on to do great things.
Yeah, no, it was definitely a very interesting conversation to listen to, and that was probably my biggest takeaway too. Is it which is also my general probably number one learning I've come since I've joined cyber several months back, which has been like it's still all about people, and no matter where you go and what you do, that still becomes the number one thing to keep in mind. So his points around keeping in mind what their perspective will be and how they will receive, because I think what makes cyber seemingly so complex is the jargon, and a lot of people who then speak that don't always appreciate that others don't always know all the full things. So then once you don't actually get the message across, the conversation's over, or you don't get the actions you want to have. So trying to remove the jargon, keep it simple. That's what I've done in several other industries, and some of the learnings I had as I was growing up as a business person. And my last company, for example, was just keep it very simple, make the point first, and then provide some supporting information afterwards. And then you can add on some more details and explain things. Yeah, maybe we should invest in a better Zoom things, Zoom level, so we can go past minutes.
No, what is your expression? Selectively cheap. I like free Zoom, if for nothing else, that it keeps me from talking forever, because I know like if I talk too much, I'm going to get kicked out of the meeting,
Right.
and then I'm going to have to do some splicing. I'm not that good at video editing anyway. So yeah, free Zoom for life. Well, cool. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. Great conversation with Steve today. Coming up soon, we're going to try to line up some interesting conversations around the impacts of cybermetrics and dashboards, for better or for worse. So stay tuned, join us there. And as always, happy cybering.
Thank you.
As always, as if I've ever said that before.